If any warplane can be considered the most romantic, it would realistically be the British Spitfire. But for me personally, the next two British icons would be the de Havilland Mosquito and the Hawker Typhoon. So I've edited a special British two-title tribute of these multitask planes. The Typhoon, one of the fastest aircraft of its time. The Mosquito, unique as it was mostly made of wood. I hope you enjoy this double feature. Slanch Liam Dale.
The Mosquito was one of the most potent weapons of the Second World War. British invention in the face of adversity had produced an aircraft that could fly higher and faster than any other operational aircraft in the world. In an age where the standard material for manufacture had become metal, the Mosquito was made almost entirely from wood. But far from being a throwback to the early days of aviation, the Mosquito employed this material in a groundbreaking and innovative way. On entering service, it immediately won the affections of its pilot and crew and soon became an indispensable part of the RAF strike force. It could fly very fast, far, high and low. Equipped with cameras, bombs, machine guns or rockets, it was unequaled. It was the first truly multi-role aircraft of which the RAF has had no real replacement up until today's Panavia Tornado. This incredible versatility stems from the aircraft's excellent power-to-weight ratio. In simple terms, more power, less weight, more speed. The designers predicted that without the machine guns of bigger bombers and the crew to operate them, the aircraft would be able to outpace contemporary German fighters. The working drawings they produced were of an aircraft with extreme aerodynamic cleanliness. Its sweeping, elegant line somehow looked right, and as history went on to prove, it did indeed fly right. The Mosquito was the brainchild of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland. In the early 1900s, the young de Havilland had a burning desire to be involved in the then fledgling aviation industry. He teamed up with fellow engineer Frank Earl. In 1908, the pair produced their first aeroplane. In the second aircraft they produced, de Havilland taught himself to fly. By the time the First World War broke out 6 years later, de Havilland had established a company producing a series of combat aeroplanes, notably the DH-4 high-performance bomber, the DH-9 reconnaissance bomber built in vast numbers, and the DH-10 intended for bombing German industry. After the war, the de Havilland Aircraft Company concentrated on civilian aircraft, including the highly successful Moth biplanes and twin-engined airliners. But perhaps more important than all of these for the future development of the Mosquito was the de Havilland 88, or Comet, a streamlined design constructed of wood. This was designed for the England to Australia air race of 1934, which it won. It completed the 11,000-mile flight in 71 hours. In spite of its success, the British government was not interested in developing the design for military purposes. Undeterred, in 1938, de Havilland and his chief engineer, C.C. Walker, reapproached the Air Ministry with a new design. It was for a high-speed, unarmed bomber made out of wood. The ministry responded cautiously and rejected an idea that they perceived to be a regressive step in aircraft design. They believed that military aircraft were no longer made of wood and that they were not prepared to divert resources from proven designs to untested ones. The effect of this, however, was only to make de Havilland more determined to prove his point. By the time he returned to Hatfield, he resolved to continue regardless. Design work commenced immediately at the de Havilland headquarters. However, with war looming, de Havilland began to get concerned that his design team would be split up by the Air Ministry, who may have seconded them for use on other projects. In September 1939, at the outset of the war, the preliminary design of the Mosquito was well underway. At this crucial stage, de Havilland took action and spirited his design team away to Salisbury Hall, 8 miles away from the Hatfield works, where work could continue uninterrupted. 2 months later, there was a breakthrough. The far-sighted Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman commissioned the first prototype. This was a compromise, however, as he insisted it should be used as a reconnaissance aircraft rather than a bomber. In the early part of the Second World War, things were going badly for the Allies. France had fallen, and Britain was bracing itself for the inevitable battle to come.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news, and this is Stuart Hibbard reading it. A large number of British and French troops have arrived safely from northern France. Allied forces are holding out round Dunkirk and on the line of the Yser. The air battle of the beaches at Dunkirk raged unceasingly all yesterday, while the withdrawal of Allied troops continued. At dusk, British fighter pilots had shot down 56 bombers and fighters. 42 of these were...
During this period of high tension and confusion, the project was cancelled again. Undaunted, de Havilland went back to the ministry and argued that the Mosquito was a special case. He felt it could revolutionize the pattern of air warfare. Furthermore, its wooden construction would make only slight demands on strategic materials that were in such demand for British arms manufacturers. After considerable deliberation, the ministry decided to reinstate the Mosquito project. However, they insisted that this should not interfere with the company's more pressing work of producing moth trainers to carry bombs in a futile last-minute attempt to help repel the possible invasion. The Battle of Britain had begun.
It was radar that first gave warning of the coming storm. Warning of an enemy armada assembling in the Pas-de-Calais. The wires started to hum, wires that led to every gun site and airfield in southern England. As yet, the enemy was but a pattern on the radar screen, a symbol on the plotting table. But these things told us that this was the biggest thing yet.
During this desperate period, the design team and engineers at Salisbury Hall doggedly carried on with the construction of the prototype in a hangar disguised as a barn behind the house.
The site was disguised as a farm building area, or at least an agricultural area, and I'm sure that people on the buses as they went past the gate and stopped nearby were wondering why farm workers were apparently coming out to work on the night shift. The security of the site was never compromised while the Mosquitoes were being built here, even though a German spy landed about 2 miles away by parachute, but he was soon captured. In fact, within 24 hours he was in jail.
In November 1940, the aircraft was completed. It was transported to Hatfield for its maiden flight. Remarkably, it had been less than a year since the design team started working in earnest.
She was covered with tarpaulins to hide her form from frequent German raiders. The technicians liked the look of her very much. A few straight hops, and off she went on her first flight. She was a joy to behold. She looked right, and she was right.
The 45-minute test flight was a resounding success, and as the flight test program progressed, the results of this filtered back to Whitehall. Any qualms they had about the validity of the project dissipated. The ministry's newfound enthusiasm for the project was backed by orders for quantity production. The de Havilland factory at Hatfield soon became only one of the centres involved in mass construction.
The main bomber production line was at Hatfield, and the main fighter bomber production line was at Leavesden, with other fighter bombers produced at Standard Motors and bombers produced at Luton and later on at Chester and Christchurch. I'm standing in front of the Mosquito prototype, which is the only World War II combat aircraft to be preserved anywhere in a museum in the world. This aeroplane has essentially changed very little in terms of the final design. De Havilland's really got it right first time. The aeroplane we have here has had modifications on the underside where you can see on the access door there's a clear circle panel, and another one in the bomb bay on the bomb door, which were used for photographic reconnaissance trials, still as an unarmed aeroplane. On the engine cowlings, this aeroplane is fitted with the flame damper exhaust covers used on the night fighters so that the aeroplane would not show up quite so well in the dark, and also it helps shield the flames from the exhaust from the crew who needed to maintain good night vision. The prototype also was unique in having leading edge slats on the wings which were not used in production, and this is the only aeroplane to have them, and they are now locked in a closed position. Another thing about this aeroplane, which shows how easy it is to repair a wooden aircraft and how tough they can be, on the fuselage there is an irregular patch. What actually happened was that the tail wheel got caught in a rut during its trial program at Boscombe Down, and it split the woodwork. And the chief designer, R.E. Bishop, went down to Boscombe, got out his chalk, and he drew around a pattern and said to the guys, make a patch to that shape which will do for the repair. It was painted yellow so that it was distinctive and was really shown as a prototype, because an unfamiliar aeroplane flying around during the early part of World War II could well have been considered by the gunners as a hostile aeroplane and might well have been a useful target.
The wooden airframe facilitated subcontracting. Any firm with woodworking experience was pressed into service. A furniture manufacturer and a school desk builder made wings. A piano maker and a coffin manufacturer supplied sections of fuselage. Smaller components were built in assorted workshops and even garden sheds. This dispersal prevented enemy air raids from disrupting production. With construction well underway, testing and development continued. Gradually, the remarkable qualities of the aircraft became apparent. Stress engineers tested wooden components to destruction.
My name is Ralph Hare, and I was working on the design of this Mosquito here at Salisbury Hall from October 1939 until we moved back to Hatfield in April 1942. I have in my hand here a piece of fuselage shell which consists of two thin skins of birch plywood supported by the light filling, which is balsa wood. Now, the big advantage of this arrangement is that the skins, if not supported in this way, would underload, buckle, either by compressive forces or by shearing forces. And that buckling would limit the strength of the plywood to something very much smaller than this panel represents. Now, I have compared the efficiency of the Mosquito structure with an equivalent metal design using the information we had when we designed the Flamingo. And what I find is that in most respects, the Mosquito design is superior to the metal equivalent. And had the design been continued in metal, it would have been a heavier weight aeroplane.
It was found that the wing skins could withstand a loading of 41 tons on each side. In layman's terms, the wing could carry the weight of 700 men. Because this strength was mainly in the skin, only minimal internal bracing was required, allowing the airframe to be lighter and smaller. First, the bulkheads were fixed into slots in the mold. Then the 2mm skin of birch plywood was applied. An interlayer of balsa was then added to act as a stabilizer. Finally, on went the outer layer of ply. The whole construction was then bonded and clamped with steel clamps.
This is known as carapace or lobster shell construction. And like a lobster, the fuselage is served up in halves, a fact which greatly facilitates the installation of equipment, controls, bonding, hydraulic, pneumatic and electric lines.
The undercarriage struts contained columns of rubber blocks, an imaginative and simple solution which negated the need for more complicated hydraulics. The slender profile of the Merlin engines with their radiators built into the wings preserved the pure aerodynamic form. The design incorporated propellers that could be feathered that would prevent a damaged engine from windmilling. The flight trials, which were made up of 79 flights, were completed in 3 months. They confirmed the designer's predictions that the Mosquito would be as fast as a fighter. In fact, it was faster. At that time, it was the fastest aircraft in the world. It was originally designed to take 4 250-pound bombs. The designers concluded that there was so much latitude in the power-to-weight ratio that by shortening the fin on the standard 500-pound bomb, 4 of these could be carried, thereby doubling the bomb load. With British cities under nightly attack, a night fighter version was pressed forward. Here, the bombs were replaced by 4 20mm cannon, augmented by 4 machine guns in the nose, giving very concentrated and destructive firepower. For the first time in aviation history, a bomber had turned into a fighter.
On
on May the 15th, 1941, from a 450-yard field beside its secret hangar in the country, the fighter prototype made its first takeoff.
By this time, preparations for mass production were also being made in Canada. The first Mosquito entered service with the RAF in July 1941, and 3 months later, it made its first operational sortie. This was a photo reconnaissance mission over enemy harbors. Its range and its ability to fly fast at high altitude allowed Allied intelligence to be gathered from the whole of occupied Europe. By December, the RAF had 20, and by March, 50, comprising of bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft. The wooden construction had another positive attribute. Most battle damage could be repaired using simple carpentry techniques. A wingtip, for example, could be taken from stock and attached with a simple butt joint. As the war progressed, the Mosquito was continuously developed.
My name is Ian Thirsk and I'm the curator of film here at the RAF Museum at Hendon. I'd like to show you some rare archive film of mosquitoes which to my knowledge has never been seen before. This sequence depicts the Canadian Mosquito bomber production line at down to Toronto. The first Canadian-built Mosquito flew in September 1942, initially using English parts and equipment. These are Mosquito Mark 25s, which were fitted with American-built Packard Merlin engines. The initial batch did actually have English equipment within them, but eventually it was all changed over to Canadian-built home equipment. American national pride was injured by the introduction of the Mosquito because they did not possess an aeroplane with comparable performance. Indeed, an early Canadian Mosquito was delivered for trials at the American Research Centre at Wright Field. The Canadian test pilot walked into the hangar one day to find 2 piles of sawdust beneath the aircraft with a notice in the front saying, "Warning, termites at work." The Americans were later convinced of the Mosquito's virtues.
Due to its ability to outperform enemy fighters, losses were comparatively small. The crews responded with total dedication to their aircraft. The pilots even found that by polishing their machines, they could gain a further 15 knots and reduce their fuel consumption.
Pilots could see that the best way to use such speed and maneuverability was to fly in at rooftop height, where neither ground guns... On August 8, 15 Mosquitoes of No. 2 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force, attacked a large school at Eglinton, in which 300 German troops were holding out against the Maquis. Attacks on enemy headquarters and similar targets were carried out during July and August by Mosquitoes of No. 2 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force. These attacks were made with great precision and invariably surprised the enemy by the speed and accuracy with which they were carried out.
The Mosquito's rugged design and maneuverability made it ideal for low-level bombing. Elite squadrons were formed, which quickly became known for their precision attacks. Flying at rooftop height, neither ground guns nor German radio detection equipment could concentrate upon them. This confusion was further heightened by flight planners plotting zigzag routes, which would fool enemy fighter cover. In fact, its superb flying characteristics made it suitable for some of the most daring low-level raids of the war, including strikes on Gestapo headquarters and the famous Amiens prison raid.
In Amiens jail, over 100 French patriots awaited execution. The RAF came to their rescue. One Mosquito squadron was to breach the walls. A second was to destroy the parts of the building where the German guards were housed. Group Captain Pickard led the attack. An RAF film unit cameraman went along to take pictures. After takeoff, the weather was appalling. It snowed hard. But as the Mosquitoes crossed the French coast, the weather cleared. The aircraft made their attack. Afterwards, the camera Mosquito took these pictures. One of the most exacting attacks of the war had succeeded. The walls had been breached, many Germans had been killed, over 100 French patriots had joined their friends outside. But the Mosquito, carrying Pickard and his navigator Broadley, did not return to base. Since that day, Group Captain Pickard has been found in an unmarked grave near his last target.
By the spring of 1943, the Mosquito was entering service in ever-increasing numbers. The distinctive sound of the twin Merlin engines could be heard 24 hours a day as Mosquitoes set course for targets all over Europe.
Wood, since time immemorial, has been one of the most valuable weapons of war. It is not so very long ago since the mightiest fleets of the world were built from wood, just sea-going trees, in fact. But if somebody told you that these fallen giants would soon be winging their way across the Channel to blast Germany's war machine, you would probably think he was a little gone in the head. Nevertheless, just as in the past Britain put wood to sea, so today she puts it in the air. In Canadian factories, as in Britain, the transformation takes place. Wood is being shaped and given wings to fly. Slowly but surely, trees are turning into aeroplanes. Aeroplanes made entirely of wood that have, in all-round performance, beaten anything yet built. Perhaps you've guessed their identification. They started as night fighters, but have done practically every type of work. Terrific speed made them ideal for photo reconnaissance. Terrific power allowed them to carry loads equal to bombers twice their size. I expect you've all guessed what they are by now. But for those still in doubt, Mosquito's the name. Just flying trees. It's a fact.
On March 16, the railway and industrial centre of Würzburg was the object of a night attack by Bomber Command.
The Allied heavy bombing
Results were
campaign
excellent.
was stepped up in the
Great
second half of the war. Although these aircraft were successfully penetrating enemy airspace, they weren't necessarily hitting their targets. Indeed, on some occasions, they didn't even hit the right town. Highly trained aircrew and valuable aircraft were being sacrificed, and often the effect on the enemy was less than impressive. Bomber Command were increasingly worried about this problem, and it was in the solution to this that the Mosquito played possibly its most important role, that of Pathfinder.
I'm Reg Davey and I'm sitting in a B-35 Mosquito. It is slightly different from the Mosquitoes I flew in on pathfinding duties. The nose of our aircraft was completely blacked out and filled with radar gear and aerials, and we dropped our target indicators completely on dead reckoning and radar. Flying as a pathfinder demanded a very accurate degree of navigation and a very, very high degree of accurate flying on the part of the pilot, because most of our exploits were on time to the nearest second. We had a radar set in the nose which we pulled out. That was the G set, which could give us a fix, but about halfway across the North Sea the Germans jammed it. And then as we approached the enemy coast, I had an H2S radar set which was situated behind the pilot. And this gave us a picture of the ground. It could not be jammed by the Germans. It could pick out coastlines, rivers, lakes, headlands, and the mush of a town. And this, combined with our accurate navigation, gave us our position. and we normally ran in on a certain landmark like a lake or little headland. As the indicators were reaching the ground, a photo flash went off and that took a picture of the ground. At that time I had to take a picture of the actual radar screen with a camera which we had on legs, so that when we got back to our airfield there was an analysis as to the accuracy of our dropping of the flares.
The accuracy of this marking was obviously vital to the success of the following raid. .617 Squadron, famous for the raids on German dams, perpetuated their fame with further daring pathfinding missions as the war progressed. In fact, many famous pilots were to become associated with the aircraft during the war. It was an aeroplane that encouraged pilots to push themselves and their machines to the limits. Another one of these was John Cunningham, a night fighter pilot. He notched up such considerable success in the early part of the war that the British media nicknamed him Cat's Eyes Cunningham.
The Air Ministry decided to explain why I had had those by saying that I had exceptional night vision. That was not true. It was solely due to the fact that I and my radar operator had a radar set that gave us some information on the aeroplane or the target that we were following. And from that security angle, the fact that I was given incorrectly exceptional night vision did prove, I think, fairly effective in keeping people unaware that we were actually flying with radar. As a wing commander, I was appointed to command a night fighter squadron of Mosquitoes in the beginning of 1943. Before that, I had had 1 and a bit years flying the Blenheim as a night fighter, followed by 2 years with the Bow fighter, and that was the first effective night fighter that the Royal Air Force had. The Mosquito was approximately 100 miles an hour faster than the Bow fighter, and it was essential that the night squadrons had a Mosquito, because in the 1940, late 42 onwards, the German aircraft flying over the country at night were really going too fast for the Bow fighter. So we were very lucky to have this splendid aeroplane, perhaps the fastest aeroplane that was built during the war.
And Mosquitoes, now with improved equipment, got busy in 1943 when the enemy sent his fastest single-engine fighters to England with a puny bomb load, copying the Mosquito technique. But they failed, because our Mosquito fighters could catch these hit-and-run raiders.
On the short time that the night fighter had to catch up with fighter bombers, the Merlin engine used to run at full power and full boost for quite a long time, and really gave seldom any trouble. The only disadvantage to the Merlin installation in the Mosquito was that when you came up close behind an aircraft that you were firing at and hit it, some of the lighter weight bits and pieces would come back and would perhaps puncture the radiators which lie between the fuselage and the engine, and it was liable to lose your coolant, and you would then have the engine boil, and you'd have to feather the engine. But the Mosquito flew extraordinarily well and would go very long distances, many hundreds of miles in some cases for the bombers, with only one engine working, and it still had a good performance. I'm sitting in a Mosquito bomber version this moment, and the night fighter had the same instrument panel and similar controls and layout of engine instruments, but the radar in the night fighter was mounted alongside the instrument panel on the right here, and my radar operator sat beside me, and so that he could lean forward and look into the radar tubes. Very effective layout for pilot and radar operator. When we got a radar contact at night, we never knew, and the ground was never able to tell us whether it was a hostile or one of our own aircraft that we were following. As a consequence, we always had to close in on whatever radar contact we were following to a point where we could identify it with our own eyes, and that meant closing in to almost vertically beneath the aircraft we were following to look up and determine from the wing plan form that we could see from beneath whether it was a German or one of our own aircraft. So one had to rely on following it to the combat with your own eyes, and that meant moving up slowly so that we were level with the target ahead of us, and when that happened, that's when you fired at it.
Nighttime nuisance bombing was another role that the Mosquito was given. Because of their speed, only 11 aircraft were lost after the first 1,000 sorties. By now, this small aircraft was carrying a medium bomber load to German cities, unarmed and without the need for a fighter escort. Even at the time, official figures suggested that it was possible for Mosquitoes, in terms of overall effectiveness, to drop 4.5 times the weight of bombs that even Britain's premier heavy bomber, the Lancaster, could manage. But Bomber Command stuck to its concept of the strategic superiority of the heavy bomber. In hindsight, a reappraisal of those policies might have saved the lives of many aircrew. It was only towards the end of the war that Mosquitoes, now equipped with 4,000-pounders, started a systematic bombing campaign led in by Mosquito Pathfinders. By the spring of 1945, Mosquitoes had delivered over 15,000 tons of high explosives.
It represented a small capital asset with a small crew, exposed to less danger because of its speed, and exposed to danger for less time.
In June 1944, when Hitler's V-1 flying bombs started raining down on London and the home counties, Mosquitoes were tasked to shoot them down. Powered by a pulse jet engine, these missiles were difficult to catch. However, the Mosquitoes successfully destroyed over 600 in the first 9 weeks of the campaign.
Not surprisingly, a naval version of the Mosquito was developed for use on aircraft carriers. Very few of these airplanes were actually built because the Mosquito's successor, the twin-engine de Havilland Hornet, is much more adaptable for use on aircraft carriers.
After shore practice, a converted Mosquito Mark VI fighter bomber was successfully landed on HMS Indefatigable off the Scottish coast on March the 25th, 1944. It looked a practical proposition from the first. Besides the combination of increased load with high performance, there was the advantage of twin-engine security over the ocean.
This film shows some United States Army Air Force Mosquito PR-16s that were based at RAF Watton in Norfolk. The American Air Force used these for weather and photo reconnaissance, plus some cloak and dagger work, which basically involved supplying arms to agents in occupied Europe. Towards the end of the European War, with the advent of the German jets, the Americans began to supply fighter escorts to their own photo reconnaissance Mosquitoes. These were Mustang aircraft, and unfortunately they had trouble keeping up with the Mosquito because the Mosquitoes were just too fast for them.
Between January the 1st of 1945 and May the 8th of the same year, the Mosquito and Beaufighter squadrons of Coastal Command carried out over 5,000 sorties against enemy shipping. The majority of the attacks were against vessels in Norwegian waters, where the shipping routes along the coast took the place of roads and railways, carrying vital German war materials. These attacks played a crucial part in disrupting German communications in this area, and was the main reason why the German garrison in Norway surrendered to the Allies without resistance. Apart from the rockets and cannon used for this purpose, some Mosquitoes were equipped with a 57mm anti-tank weapon. This fired 6-pound shells fed by a mechanism specially designed by a cigarette vending machine manufacturer. These were fired at the rate of over 1 a second. The gun itself weighed over a ton, and its firing had to be carefully tested to ensure that it did not overstrain the wooden airframe. In this variant, over half a ton of additional armor plating was fitted to protect the crew and engines from return fire. The next development to the Mosquito's arsenal was the rocket, 8 of which could be mounted on pylons, with 4 under each wing. This rocket salvo was the equivalent to the broadside of a cruiser equipped with 6-inch guns. From June 1943 until the end of the war, fighters and fighter bombers were employed against land targets. These intruder squadrons were initially based in the UK. As the Allies advanced, intruder bases were set up in every theatre from Malta, Italy, Sardinia, and later from France, India, and even Australia. Their actions caused chaos amongst retreating enemy forces.
Officers and men of the self-termed Independent Air Force messed together. As the first Mosquito intruder outfit, this squadron has a wonderful record of kills from German aircraft to trainers. Officers and sergeants helped the ground crew to bomb up. Targets are chosen by the CO from various reports received, and then the crews are briefed in the usual way. The squadron termed itself the Independent Air Force because when normal intruder targets are not available, command permits them to act on their own.
Like Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, another tenacious engineer committed to the British war effort was Barnes Wallis. His famous invention of the bouncing bomb successfully destroyed 2 German dams. A later development of this weapon was designed for use with the Mosquito. It was codenamed Highball. 15 of these Highball-equipped Mosquitoes were dispatched to Australia, where they were to be used against the Japanese fleet. However, this was one Mosquito development that was never used in anger, as the Second World War was brought to a sudden conclusion by the atom bomb attacks.
Post-war, the Mosquito was used for a number of record-breaking flights because of its high speed and long range. This film was taken at Heathrow Airport in 1947 and shows Mickey Martin, one of the original Dambuster pilots, and Flight Lieutenant Ted Sismore ready to board a Mosquito Mark 34 for a record-breaking flight to Cape Town, which they reached in a record time of 21 hours 31.5 minutes. It speaks volumes for the Mosquito in the fact that it was able to perform first-line duties in the era of a jet age. In fact, the Mosquito was in first-line service until December the 15th, 1955. The Mosquito completed its service career in a rather unglamorous role of target tug, a far cry from the initial dazzling bomber concept. The target tug Mosquitoes were painted in the silver finish with black and yellow stripes beneath the wings to denote its role as a second-line aircraft. They were finally retired in May 1963, and this film was shot to commemorate that particular occasion. After the flypast, most of the aeroplanes were sold to a film company and appeared in the film 633 Squadron. 2 of them were sold to private concerns, and one of them is now the last flying Mosquito in the world. It's flown by British Aerospace at Chester.
It was an aircraft that could take any amount of damage, any amount of flak, and it would get you home.
I had the distinction of being shot down not far from Boulogne.
I was really scared, scared stiff on many, many occasions.
It happened more than once that a tail came off the machine, and at that time nobody whose tail came off survived.
At times I was shit scared.
He said, well, you'll only be about an hour and a half. Won't take very long. In fact, it took just about 12 months, because that's when I got shot down.
The Hawker Typhoon stirred up very mixed feelings with anyone who had anything to do with it after it came into service with the RAF on the 11th of September 1941 at Duxford Aerodrome in Cambridgeshire.
My first meeting with the Typhoon was at Duxford in 1942. We were in the first Typhoon wing, and eventually we went on operations, but they were peripheral operations. They're going mainly along the French coast with the object of a customer asked to flying in the Typhoon on operations and avoiding, they hoped, and successfully, avoiding an aircraft being shot down and being taken to pieces by the Germans. My impression of the machine was that it was a very clumsy instrument. It was big and about twice the size of a Spitfire, I should think, and it had very clumsy attributes, such as a car-type door and a window which could be wound down rather like a car door. So it wasn't a favourable first impression, but eventually we got to find it quite a comfortable machine, although it was a very apt to judder. It happened more than once that a tail came off the machine, and at that time nobody whose tail came off survived. The engine was a Sabre, 24-cylinder. It wasn't reliable, and the consequence was that a number of people had to make forced landings.
The pilot calmly discusses his ordeal with other members of his squadron.
The Typhoon was a far more powerful machine than the Spitfire, as you'd expect. There were only, I think the Spitfire had a Merlin engine at 12 cylinders, and the Typhoon had a Sabre engine, Napier Sabre engine with 24 cylinders. So as you would expect, it was much more powerful and much faster, much higher rate of climb. And in fact, it was at that time, I think, probably the fastest fighter in the world.
Much of the Hawker Typhoon lies back in those days of the biplanes, those old silver-winged beasties flying around the sky. However, underneath the skin of those biplanes was a unique assembly invented by Sir Sidney Cam, as he later became, which used bolts to bolt tubes together, which made for an easy way of constructing an airframe. Anybody could do it. Following on from the biplanes, such as the Hind and the Hart, would become the Hurricane. This still used a very similar idea. You took metal tubes, you bolted them together onto fairly substantive frames. The front part of your aeroplane, you're covered in metal to protect the engine and the pilot, the rest was fabric, easy to repair. Now obviously you couldn't completely take this idea on to create the Typhoon, or its next door neighbour, its nearest sibling, the Tornado. When the specification was issued for the aircraft that would become the Typhoon, the specification also called for the use of different engines. One of these obviously was the Napier Sabre, and the other would be the Rolls-Royce Vulture. The Vulture engine had this horrible propensity to burst into flames. Very few Tornadoes were built. They all ended up as test and evaluation aeroplanes and would eventually be scrapped. Early Typhoons, the very first production, or not production, but the prototype versions, would follow on in many ways, would draw on many of the Hurricane lessons or Hurricane ideas to create the aeroplane. Early aeroplanes had virtually all metal canopies. The problem with that, of course, reduction in the amount of vision. Fighter pilot, you need to be able to see literally 360 degrees if it's possible. It was a car door type. It was difficult to get out of. Guns freezing, cold guns. Breeches freeze up, guns don't fire. Very embarrassing. Answer, take ducting from the engine, feed out to the wings. Suddenly, guns work nice and happy, guns all fire.
In my time in the Typhoon, it was armed with machine guns and or cannon.
The early production batch of Typhoons were all fitted with Browning machine guns. These were 8 in number, originally intended to be 12. However, this second option had been removed from the specification as it had been realised that A, the weight would have been too great, and B, the time taken to reload these guns after every sortie would have kept the aircraft on the ground for far too long.
One of the flight commanders, who was a Belgian, a very good chap and very popular and a good pilot, was taking off in formation because it was a grass airfield, and in the early morning, and his tyre burst, and the consequence was that he ran into the next Typhoon, and he was killed. But the chap in the next Typhoon, in fact, survived, although he was severely shaken. And he eventually became, he was a Belgian, eventually became the CEO of the squadron. The Typhoon was much more roomy than a Spitfire, and indeed a Hurricane was more roomy than a Spitfire. In the Spitfire, the machine fitted around you more or less like a glove, but not so the Hurricane, and certainly not so the Typhoon. You were sitting in the Typhoon. You didn't feel that the Typhoon and you were all one part of one unit. There were a great many more instruments than there were on the Spitfire, and of course you very soon became accustomed to them and looked at the ones that mattered to you and didn't bother about the ones that didn't.
Once it had been decided that the Typhoon might make a very good ground attack aeroplane, the first thing that was required was clearances of various bombs already in the Royal Air Force's inventory. The standard weapon normally carried by the Typhoons during attack raids, when they were actually acting as bomb-foons, would be the 250-pounder or the 500-pounder. New weapons would come on stream, such as very rudimentary cluster bombs, incendiary bombs, and also napalm tanks were also trialled underneath the Typhoon, although they were never adopted as a standard weapon.
Halton Camp. Once in a while, the workshops of this famous training centre are quiet and deserted. For once in a while, Halton takes time off to celebrate its great record of service. A parade of cadets and their mascot is held upon the square. For 25 years, Halton has been turning apprentices into craftsmen. Craftsmen who, in their turn, help to build up the Air Force of today.
I had a very hairy moment in the Typhoon at Manston. I was a flight commander, and we were on readiness one morning when the weather was absolutely filthy. And I told operations that we couldn't fly because the weather was too bad. So they said, well, could you send up just a couple of aircraft? I said, no, the weather's too bad. So they said, well, you could send up just one aircraft. So I said, well, of course, you could always send up one aircraft. So obviously I felt obliged to go up myself. I took off, and it was indeed, I was in cloud almost before I left the ground. But worse than that, I found that the Bofors gun on the edge of the airfield attacked me, and I could see these cannon shells going very uncomfortably close to my wing. I don't know how they didn't hit me. At Manston we were engaged mainly on protecting the country against German raiders. And secondly, we became engaged because the CEO, Roland Beaumont, decided this was a good thing, engaged in attacking German communications. So we became accustomed to doing ground attack, often at night, and attacking trains successfully. The loss of Typhoons was very small. So this was really the precursor of the use of the Typhoon as a ground attack aircraft, which went on to great success during the invasion, when they were armed with rockets.
I volunteered for the RAF in 1941. I was subsequently sent to Canada and to number 10 Elementary Flying Training School in Hamilton, Ontario. Then graduated in Harvard's and subsequently got my wings in June 1942. I was posted to a Canadian fighter squadron, 130 fighter squadron, flying Hurricane Mark 12s, which were a delightful aircraft to fly. I flew those for months until subsequently I was posted back to England, where I joined 198 fighter squadron, who were flying Typhoons, the Typhoon 1B. Bit of a frightening experience really to start with, because the first time that you flew in one was your solo, you might say. Takeoff speed was about 130 miles an hour before she got unstuck. Coming into land, coming over the fence at about 180 miles an hour, 200 to 180 miles an hour, and touching down at about 110.
The original batch of Typhoon fighter bombers were fitted with 8 Browning machine guns. However, a bigger firepower was needed, a more concentrated firepower was needed, and although Hispano cannons still are one of the best weapons available, there were problems in acquiring enough breech blocks to make these guns available in large enough quantities. However, once this had become available, the next production batches of Typhoons were all going to be fitted with 4 20mm cannons, as this would concentrate a large amount of firepower in a small circle in the shortest possible time, thereby causing the most destruction. Except of course for the very small batch of fighter reconnaissance aeroplanes where one of the cannons was replaced with photography equipment.
We did have a problem with the aircraft engine, with carbon monoxide. It wasn't really the engine, it was the design of the aircraft. Drew the engine nacelles were forward, as is natural, and then the design drew a lot of the frames inside the cockpit. And so we had to fly at all times with oxygen. The other snag was that, and I was caught with this once, closing the canopy head. And on the end of your gloves, there was a small tag. And if you weren't careful, you'd catch the tag in the canopy, between the canopy and the roof, as it were, and be stuck up there with your hand. And it's not too easy to land a Typhoon with one hand up in the air like this and only one hand to handle everything else.
Napier's Sabre was the attempt to bolt 2 engines together and drive them through a common drive shaft. Unfortunately for everybody concerned, although it looked good on paper, the Sabre would start to suffer from certain problems. The first of these would be problems with the oil feed. This would become clogged and cause the engine to overheat and eventually to seize, causing our intrepid pilot to either abandon his aeroplane or follow it down into the crash landing. Having dealt with the oil feed problem, Napier's found another one. This would be problems with the seatings of the valves. These had not undergone the process known as nitriding. This meant that there would be build-ups of carbon and metal particles which would cause the valves to malfunction. Eventually, with help from Bolt and Paul, all of these problems would be overcome, although it would take many years before the Sabre would become a reliable engine on the front of the Typhoon and later the early Mark Tempests.
Intent of 198 Squadron was a South Coast defence, and we were employed principally on this task for quite a long time, whereby you'd have to maintain a cockpit standby from the early hours, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Most boring thing, really, except we didn't know when you'd be sent off into the air.
The Typhoon squadrons based on the south coast had one task only, and that was to hit incoming raiders who were Focke-Wulf 190s. There was slight confusion at certain times between the Typhoon and the Focke-Wulf 190, although it should be borne in mind that there was a great disparity in size. The problem, of course, with chasing a Focke-Wulf 190 was that if it climbed height, the Typhoon was lost. But at low level, the Typhoon would win hands down every time.
From late 1941 till April 1943, hundreds of trains had been destroyed by rhubarbs.
A rhubarb is when you take off and fly over enemy territory at about 200-300 feet. You were just given a general direction, and you could do what you wanted. Make as much nuisance of yourself as you could. It usually meant attacking trains, and they were great to attack, because a little humble train would blow up into a million fragments if you hit it with a few cannon shell.
I was born in Germany in 1921 to a sort of upper middle class Berlin family, and I had a very good childhood until the Nazis with Hitler came into power. Being Jewish, we had to leave Germany and fortunately immigrated to England in 1934. And we were considered friendly aliens in those days. We had to pass a tribunal. I had always tried to join the Air Force. My application was accepted. And in 1941, I transferred to the RAF and then was sent to Canada for training. And from Canada went to the United States. I had elementary training in Lakeland, Florida, and my advanced training in a place called Dothan, Alabama, where I finally graduated as a fully fledged pilot, earning my silver wings and RAF wings. And up to this present day, I don't know what happened. Whether suddenly somebody discovered that I was still a German national, that my father had been in the German army, or other reasons, I don't know. In any case, I was sent back to England and then trained some more, eventually on Hurricanes, then joined 609 West Riding Squadron in October of 1943, on the day they celebrated their 200th victory in the air.
Possibly the greatest and the most explosive, literally, extra added to the Typhoon's armoury would be the 60-pound rocket, and would be released by Typhoons in great waves of explosive rocketry across the sky. A maximum of 8 of these weapons could be carried, and their primary purpose was for the destruction of tanks and other soft-skinned vehicles.
The Air Ministry must have thought that having these incredibly powerful fighters, that they would equip us with a new armament. And so, in the case of 609, they equipped us with 8 air-to-ground rockets, with each one with a 60-pound warhead, and sent us to, I think it was Fairwood Common in Wales or somewhere, to train for a certain amount of time to fire these air-to-ground rockets. So we really initiated this air-to-ground close support for the Army. We were all very excited about it because we thought, here we've got the fastest fighter in the world, now we are getting air-to-ground rockets, and we became pretty efficient at firing them. If you remember, they didn't have any gun size which would, we used our normal gun size, and you had to make a calculation for your angle of dives, roughly speed, wind direction, and if I look at my logbook, I had an average error of, I think, 56 yards. Now, if you consider that each 60-pound warhead had the explosive power of a 6-inch naval gun shell, so if you fired a salvo, you were really pretty destructive, and in 30 or 40 or 50 yards error, you were extremely useful against German tank concentrations and artillery, particularly 88 and 105 millimeter cannons.
The 2nd Tactical Air Force was formed on the 13th of November 1943. Its role would be to provide support for the ground forces as they moved across Europe should the Allies mount an invasion of the German-held continent.
The targets which must be attacked and destroyed before the Allied armies can set foot in Western Europe are scattered over a vast area and affect the whole Nazi military machine. Defences of every kind, special anti-invasion weapons, big coastal batteries, gun sites and shore defences, E-boat pens and hideouts, railway centres, engine repair shops and rolling stock, industry of every kind which helps to arm the German forces. These are the targets which are being destroyed so as to paralyze them our invading forces.
RAF rocket-firing Typhoons take on troop concentrations, strong points and army headquarters in a series of lightning attacks.
One of the main problems that afflicted the Typhoon throughout all of its career, its long, illustrious career with the Royal Air Force, was a disturbing tendency for the tail feathers to come adrift for some unexplained reason in flight. The initial thought was that the junction point where the tail unit actually was attached to the rear fuselage was failing. And initially, a very large steel strap was riveted around the outside of this to reinforce that area. However, this problem still continued. It was actually more tail heavy than it should have been. It was completely out of balance. So the design team came up with another fix for that area, which are known as fish plates. These were riveted over the joint, being about 24 in all. They're made from aluminium, so they're obviously lighter, which meant the aeroplane wasn't going to be tail heavy when it flew. This, however, wasn't quite the answer to all the problems, as odd occasions, tail ends kept coming off the aeroplane. So they started to look somewhere else. And the only other area they could look at was the elevators. Now, was the elevator flutter? Hawkers decided that possibly the flight control system was the problem. Their answer was to slightly alter the running of the rods that control the elevators, and also to completely rework the balance system for the elevators. Both these precautions, the strengthening and the changing of the elevator control system and its balance system, did result in a marked reduction in tailplane failures. Although the Typhoon did suffer from these now and again until 1945. The reason that any aeroplane is fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks is to extend its range. For the Typhoon, not only did it extend its range, it also created that wonderful thing that we use today, loiter time over target. It allowed an aeroplane with a reduced weapons load in this particular case to overfly the target or stay close to a target until called down to attack it. The original version of this fuel tank was a complete cylinder, and it had a pipe taking the fuel out and a pipe putting air pressure in. Pump the pressure in, out comes the fuel. The problem, of course, with that particular kind of thing, and Sydney Cam had actually mentioned this early on in the design stage of this tank, was that as the fuel reduced in quantity, you're going to get this terrible slopping about effect, which alters the trim of the aeroplane. To counter that, they put what are known as baffles in, which does precisely what it says. It baffles the fuel, stops it moving about, and kept it all compartmentalized, but you could still pump it out into the aircraft.
The squadron was really like a team, but when we used to go on certain fighter sweeps or recce, it was a great honor if they took you along, because normally the squadron commander or flight commanders were the first ones to have a go at an enemy fighter, and you were lucky if you managed to get a shot at them. I had an unfortunate experience that in November, I think, of '43, one of my first operations, when we were supposed to give a medium level cover to the American Mitchells, I think, I was so keen to get on the show, even though I didn't have long-range tanks. And of course, what normally happens, we missed the rendezvous, or the Americans missed the rendezvous, I can't remember. In any case, we were flying around for about 15 minutes before we caught up with the Americans, then went across the channel. They were going to bomb Abbeville. As I'm about to cross into France, my engine cut on main tanks. And I switched over to reserve, and suddenly occurred to me, how am I ever going to get back to England? And I called up my squadron commander, who was a wonderful man called Thornton Brown, and he said, "You bloody fool, reduce your revs, get a homing for Manston," which was the nearest airfield at the time. So I turned back, and unfortunately, about 5 or 6 minutes later, Thornton Brown, including 2 other pilots, were shot down by an American high-level fighter escort who had never seen a Typhoon and mistook it for Focke-Wulf 190. So that was a rather very sad and tragic happening.
The Typhoon was like many, for some reason, Allied aeroplanes, in that gunners, other fighter pilots had a great difficulty in recognizing what the aeroplane was. Bedecked as it was with roundels and fin flashes, squadron badges, squadron codes, for some reason people took an instant dislike to it and tried to shoot it down.
I had the distinction of being shot down not far from Boulogne. I was leading a flight, and I could see behind me an aircraft which I was convinced, and still am convinced, was a Spitfire, firing at me. I had a nasty shock because a bullet came through the perspex and landed up in the temperature gauge, the instrument that showed the temperature of the glycol. There was flames coming from underneath the engine cowling. I couldn't tell what temperature the engine was at because the instrument that showed me that was no longer operating. So I bailed out and had to sit in my dinghy. So I'm a lifetime member of the Goldfish Club.
To try and persuade American fighter pilots, even Spitfire pilots, not to shoot their allies down, the aircraft originally had big white bands painted on the upper and lower surfaces, and in some cases round the nose. Although this did help in keeping the itchy trigger fingers under control, it was felt that they actually made them too visible to the enemy.
And that's why we were decked out with black and white stripes to identify the Typhoon in particular, before they decided that they were going to do this black and white stripe business with all aircraft flying during the invasion. Only they changed the width of the stripes, so our aircraft had to be repainted with narrower stripes in those days.
In reality, until D-Day occurred and all the Allied aeroplanes were flying around with large quantities of black and white striping everywhere, gunners on the ground, other fighter pilots, and the Americans took great delight in shooting at the poor old Typhoon.
I remember flying top cover to a large Mosquito raid on the Eindhoven battery works, and they absolutely flattened it from one side to the other. Most impressive. It's all right, we viewed it from 7,000 feet, we were perfectly safe, but they were flying around practically at 0 feet, just in circuiting the battery works, and they just flattened it completely.
I did get hit, fortunately in an ancient Typhoon that was very well armoured. It was an old Typhoon with the coffin cockpit canopy top, and people didn't like it very much, but unfortunately my aircraft was US at that time, and I flew this, and we were attacking the Phillips works at Eindhoven, and it had armour plating below my seat, and that was hit by flak, and it fragmented the armour plating, which came up, entered my thigh and my eye, and I thought I was blinded because I looked in the rear view mirror and all I could see was a big red splot where my eye should be, blood streaming back from it. But blink, 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 and I found that I could see. There was a mess of cheek and eyelids, and there was a hole in my left thigh, but apart from that I seemed to be okay. And I came back and landed and had some surgery done on the eye, which is still not quite right. I praise the man, whoever he was, who put that armour plating underneath that particular aircraft that I was flying on that particular day.
They then formed us into the 2nd Tactical Air Force, which meant that we were attached to the British and Canadian armies prior to D-Day and had to learn to live under canvas and be extremely mobile with mobile intelligent ops setups, and became really part of the army.
I was fortunate enough to witness the invasion of Normandy, because we were sent to attack a German headquarters just behind Caen, and this involved flying across the Normandy beaches at 7,000 feet, and we had a fantastic view of the whole thing with large enemy battleships, thousands of boats and men, and I wouldn't have believed it.
One of the reasons why we were able to gain a tactical surprise over the enemy when we landed in Normandy on June 6 was that his radar stations had been the object of determined attacks by our fighter bombers and rocket-firing Typhoons. Our Typhoons flew more than 1,600 sorties, firing over 4,500 60-pound rockets.
Typhoon Pilot Sergeant Ted Dunn of 266 Squadron was the first man to bail out over enemy territory on D-Day. Slipping through enemy lines, he appeared back at his squadron, bringing with him the first enemy trophy of the invasion, a German helmet and rifle.
On D-Day, Typhoon squadrons dive-bombed the beaches and enemy strongholds in support of the army.
The Luftwaffe stayed away.
We didn't see any enemy aircraft of any kind. I was attacked by one aircraft over the beaches that day, who was an American, who couldn't identify a Typhoon.
The RAF was digging in. The standing corn was going down under the tracks of bulldozers. the sappers were laying down runways as easily as laying lino on the floor. The airfields were completed as fast as the squadrons could take them over.
As soon as the Army engineers built airstrips over in France, I think I was the first one to be sent over to find out if it was safe for the squadron to land. And I think it was an airstrip called P7. And I couldn't understand why there was so much flak over P7. Landed, and there was silence around me until I saw a lot of our steel helmets popping up from slit trenches around the airfield and signing me to jump out of the aircraft and join them. And we found out that the Germans were only about two or 3 miles away, so it was certainly not safe for a squadron to land. I had to sleep in a medical tent in a trench, and that same night the airstrip was overrun by some German panzers. And I was very fortunate to get back to England about, I think, 24 hours later. And then a few days later, it was decided it was safe.
From factory chimneys and other observation posts only a shell's throw away, the Germans watched the airfields. They watched the activities of Typhoon squadrons commanded by such aces as Group Captain Tim Maurice. For here in Normandy, the RAF was using a new form of aerial artillery, the rocket-firing Typhoon. This weapon was giving the enemy his biggest headache, a headache caused by a 6-inch shell traveling at 700 miles an hour, a projectile able to pierce the armor of any tank yet built.
We had quite a few interesting jobs after the invasion, and I remember one going down a road in Normandy and spotting a Tiger tank. And the majority of, I'll not say all of them, but the majority of tank crews would just bail out and abandon the tank. But in this case, he didn't. He was going past a pub, and he just seemed to turn rapidly and went inside the hotel through a coach entrance. I couldn't see him, so I perhaps shouldn't have done. I brought the whole hotel down on top of him with rockets.
This is the RAF rocket-firing Typhoon, Britain's deadly single-engined fighter-bomber that has done so much to break up German panzer columns. These are the rocket projectiles. They arrive in various components which are assembled by ground crews before loading into the plane. Here are the tail fins being fixed into the body, or rocket motor as it's called. Simple enough to look at, but devastating in effect. The rocket motor is now screwed into the projectile, and that's the head containing the explosive. The completed rockets are then conveyed to the waiting planes, ready for fixing. Each Typhoon carries 8 deadly rockets which are electrically fired. Many of our attacks were recorded by a movie camera placed in the wings of the plane. We are going to show you some of the films this camera took. Even without rockets, the Typhoon is a formidable weapon. It is a first-rate fighter plane with a speed of 400 miles an hour. All our aircraft are developed for their own particular job. The Typhoon has to give air support for ground forces. It is a fighter, dive bomber and rocket carrier, complete flying artillery. In one day alone, rocket-firing Typhoons destroyed 81 German tanks and immobilized 135 others in the battle for France.
The Typhoon squadrons fired salvo after salvo, hitting German forces, factories and supplies. The Allied forces had fought their way from the Normandy beaches but got bogged down in the Caen area, with the Typhoon squadrons backing up the army and destroying vehicles, troop concentrations, rail transportation, ammunition dumps and German tanks. German resistance was stiff.
The men of the rocket Typhoons were on call all the hours of daylight. But in spite of this, they always managed to find the odd pause for relaxation, the odd minute for those all-important chores.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word and the skies are not cloudy all day. The air is so pure, the zephyr so free, and the breeze is so balmy and light, that would not exchange my home on the range for all of the same ride. Oh, the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy.
The enemy shells caused damage, but the enemy shells did not interfere with business. The Typhoons might have concentrated on the enemy gunners, but there were bigger fish to fry. The Germans, too, were trying to build up a striking force, but the German supply routes were open to attack. The Typhoons had their losses, but they were light. In this case, the pilot escaped unharmed. Through a rapidly closing gap, the enemy convoys dashed out in an effort to escape.
I think there was a lot of anger at the Falaise Gap. Real anger, because Montgomery had been attacking to get through, but unfortunately there was no way that he'd get past the city of Caen. And we lost so much armour on the bocage that the tanks, our tanks, were not a match to the Germans, and they're being brewed up left, right and centre. And it's a horrible sight to go in and see under your wings. Your friends are underneath you and they are all being brewed up. It's not a nice sight. So when the Falaise Gap came and we broke through and the Germans were in full retreat and the pincer was closing on them, there was a lot of anger. And we went down and strafed with, I think, quite a lot of deliberate hate.
In 3 days, the RAF destroyed 5,000 vehicles. The roads from Falaise began to smoke with the burning wreckage of von Kluger's army. The Allied forces raced on. As they went, this is what they saw. An army had been splattered over the roads of France. Tanks and troop carriers, mobile guns and mortars, cars and carts, papers and photographs, shoes and socks, horses and men.
And we went back afterwards on the ground to look at it, and it was nauseous because a lot of the German stuff was pulled by horses, and they of course also had been shot up. But seeing the Tigers and the Panther tanks, just ruined rusty shells lying there, gave us a great deal of satisfaction.
This is the meaning of the term air power. The Battle of Normandy opened the doors of Europe. The march on Berlin has begun.
The Allies painfully continued their slow march eastwards through France during the summer of 1944. They built airstrips as they moved forward with attack and counterattack. The Typhoon squadrons continued to have their hairy moments. Rick Dupre from Australia must have been born with 9 lives.
I was told that nobody had ever overturned a Typhoon and got out of it alive, because invariably you broke your neck or your head got stuck in the mud and you died. Well, I proved this to be quite false. I was coming into land. As I approached the airfield to do the brake, to land the Typhoon, you aimed at the end of the airfield and then pulled it up in a zoom climb to lose speed. And at the top of the zoom, you dropped your flaps, you dropped the wheels, round you came, and you're in line to land. Well, as I was about halfway up the zoom climb, the engine stopped. Absolutely rigid. The 4 blades were stuck there right in front of me. And I was scared. I brought the aircraft round, and I found that I was coming in at a heck of a rate of knots. The starboard wheel hit a bomb crater that the Americans had left, and I turned over, nose over, and it was quite strange to go backwards in a Typhoon with the grass flowing the wrong way behind your head. And I landed with a crash, but fortunately I'd landed really close to 6609 airmen, the Yerks, the mechanics, and they rushed out and they actually pushed the tailplane up. And by the time they got the hood back, I fortunately had remembered to remove all the bits and pieces that attached me to the aircraft. And instead of falling out on my dome, I was able to put my hands down and save myself from breaking my neck, and crawled out from underneath. Great cheers, because it had never been done before.
Initially, after the D-Day landings, the idea was that the squadron, i.e. this time just the aircrew and their aeroplanes, would become divorced from their ground crew, who they'd actually got to know very, very well. You know, the ground crew knew the aeroplane, they knew their pilot, they could tweak one to be happy with the other. Unfortunately, some genius in command somewhere said, let's divorce our ground crews from their air crews and their aeroplanes, and we'll have them called combat servicing parties. Sounds good, didn't work. Aircrew not happy with strange people working on their aeroplanes that they didn't know. Therefore, in those kind of conditions, with an engine that had a tendency to be a bit flaky, you wanted the guy who's been loving your aircraft to death for weeks, months possibly, to be there to fix your aeroplane. And this crazy idea of mobile servicing parties was got rid of within weeks. And the ground crews and the air crews got back together again to form what was actually a very good working relationship. Landing in somewhere like northern France, in summer, when it's dry and it's windy, and you take an aeroplane with a very sensitive engine and initially not a very good filtration system, and put them all together, and you start having serious problems. In fact, the situation got so serious, they actually had to bring all the Typhoon squadrons back to the UK temporarily to develop new filters which would eliminate the dust problem. These dry fields were like dust bowls, And of course, as you went belted across the place, you get a bit of dust in the engine, it grinds things away, it keeps more dust you get in there, the more grinding damage there is, and suddenly your engine stops working.
The relentless round of rearming and maintaining the temperamental Tiffies continued day in and day out.
I can remember one particular case with Ken Adams. He was leading me and we were going down onto an attack on a 88mm gun that the Germans had positioned in a farmhouse or alongside a farmhouse, and it was stopping the Polish armour coming up the road. He went down and fired, and what happened was he didn't actually hit the 88mm, but he hit the farmhouse, which collapsed onto the 88mm. When I came in, it was struggling to get out of it. And I fired and hit it, and it was destroyed. Ken Adams didn't see this, so he came round again behind me. And as he came down, he saw something tearing out of the village and thought it was this, instead of which it was some poor German in a hay cart with a couple of horses. And unfortunately, I don't think he did it very much good.
The Germans continued to counter-attack in northern France. But with the Allies pounding the German armies day after day, they were slowly being forced to retreat eastwards.
I was never afraid of admitting that at times I was shit scared. And I shared the tent with an Australian who was my closest friend, Norman Merritt. I used to talk to him about fear, and he said, I'm not afraid. And I said, I don't believe it, you know, how can you not be afraid? And he said, Heine, which was my nickname, I am really not afraid. I remember taking him with me to Paris shortly after the liberation of Paris and introducing him to the sister of a girlfriend of mine, and he fell in love with that girl, but he was so scared he wasn't able to make it. But having said that, in the air he did not know fear.
You carried out your parachute, and when you got to the Typhoon, the tailplane was just at an obliging height that you could put the parachute on it and bend over and do it up, and then you were in a crouched position to go. But unfortunately, being in a crouched position just after breakfast and quite scared, most of the fellas did a chuck up, and if you looked along wiping your mouth, you found that most of the other characters had done exactly the same thing.
I think fear only arises when you have time to contemplate it. When you have something visible to do, like saving your life, you have no time to be afraid, you just get stuck in. It was on a Sunday, I remember, when the CO came up to me and said, look, Dickie, he said, we've just got a raid on. We've got to attack a target. He said, well, you'll only be about an hour and a half. Won't take very long. In fact, it took just about 12 months, because that's when I got shot down, behind Caen. I thought, oh shit, that's what I thought.
Diese Maschine brennt und ist Sekunden später nur noch ein qualmender Trümmer.
Living in hopes of starting the engine again, I stayed with the aircraft. And then, miraculously, a field appeared in front of me. And I piled the aircraft into the field, must have been doing about 200 miles an hour, belly landed, and walked away from it. That was the end of my Typhoon experience. I was captured and interrogated, but only mildly, because I think the Germans were a bit busy in other directions. Eventually put in a cattle truck and ended up in Sargen in Silesia, which is better known to the public as the Rocking Horse camp, I suppose, where the Great Escape happened. But that was long before my time.
In June and July, rocket-firing Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force flew more than 6,400 sorties against a variety of targets, including tanks, armored transport, enemy headquarters, airfields and communications, firing some 38,700 rockets.
Even though our operations, or our shows as we used to call them, didn't take more than 15 or 20 minutes at times, they were extremely dangerous because the army really relied on us, and when they were faced with German tanks or 88mm guns or whatever, they called in the Typhoons to destroy them. So we had introduced a system which was called cab rank, which meant that 4 aircraft were at the end of the so-called runway, and you had a grid map on your knees, and then the ACP fired I can't remember, a green or red light, and you used to take off and you climbed to about 8,000 or 9,000 feet above the airstrip, because if you went further out, you got German flak already, because they were only a few miles away. And when you got to your operational height, a controller, an RAF controller usually, or sometimes Army controller, took over in a forward tank or armored car and gave you a grid reference to fly to, and then said in 15 seconds, you will see some red, yellow or green smoke, go down and attack. So we didn't know what we were attacking. We flew over to that reference, went into a screaming dive, and then found out there were either tank concentrations or anti-aircraft emplacements and so on. And attacked and then returned to base. And the moment we took off, another section of 4 aircraft took over. So the Army had continuous air support. And when you came back, you were rearmed and then back onto the cab rank. During these operations, we had considerable losses. Mainly due to German very accurate anti-aircraft, but also because we were extremely vulnerable. It's like the helicopters today in Iraq or somewhere, flying from at 9,000 feet or 8,000 feet, diving at speed sometimes reaching almost the speed of sound, well over 550 miles an hour. The danger of pulling out too quickly in order not to hit your own debris resulted many times in the Typhoon going into a high-speed stall, which meant you had it because you flipped over on your back and straight into the ground. So we lost people, or some of our boys that way.
But the problem that afflicts all ground engineering personnel, whatever era they serve in, is weather conditions. In the winter, you're frozen, you're cold, reared all to the bone, and you're wet. And during the time that the Typhoon squadrons were in action, especially when they'd moved over to Europe, which was when it was all the improvised airfields there, when it was horrible, it was really horrible. Being a mechanic on any aeroplane in those kind of conditions is horrible. You also had all the joys and delights of rearming in a howling force 9 gale, which is, under normal conditions, was hard work.
And there was always the ever-present threat from the Luftwaffe.
The hunted tiger and struck back with all his might. Luftwaffe had gathered together all the fighters it could muster, and with them carried out surprise raids against the Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. And the Luftwaffe had met with some success. But the Luftwaffe had to pay for their success, and the price the Luftwaffe paid made it a very poor bargain indeed.
During the Typhoon's time in service, when it was employed as a leaflet bomber, there were only 2 reasons to drop leaflets. One was to persuade the Germans to surrender. They're going to lose, you might as well surrender now. The other was to the people in the Netherlands, to tell them to stay where they were, we're on our way. That was the only two reasons for using the Typhoon as a leaflet bomber. To use it as a food bomber was very much a similar idea. Occasionally, small units of the British Army, or even their own chaps, or even their own servicing parties would be left behind, or would be too far in front. Of course, you've got to get supplies to these people. You can't always take a Dakota in there. It's a glorified target for anybody with a decent anti-aircraft gun. But a Typhoon, high speed, low level, let it go. As long as they know where the target is, there's every chance they're going to hit it. The idea of using aeroplanes as food bombers, which is a strange idea, was obviously used again in Holland, where the Germans had isolated various towns in Amsterdam and all the rest of it, and said we will have the occupants starve to death. The Air Force, of course, responded by flying over with just about anything that could carry anything and releasing all these containers with food aboard, which helped all the people of Holland survive the ravages of the Germans.
That enormous radiator in front obviously ruled out any type of forced landing on water, because it acted like the plane just disappeared like a submarine.
Towards the end of the war, we were put on attacking shipping up in the Baltic, and we were told that if we fired not at the target, fire at the target with the cannon, strafe it with the cannon, but then when you fired your rockets, aim your rockets 50 to 100 yards this side of the ship, And what happened, the rockets entered the sea, levelled out and hit the ship from underwater like torpedoes. And they virtually just blew up in front of your eyes.
Just after the D-Day landings in that hot summer of 1944, the Germans unveiled a new and terrifying weapon, the V1, which was a flying bomb nicknamed the Doodlebug by the Allies. They were being launched from the Pas-de-Calais area towards London. '137 Typhoon Squadron was given yet another task, diver patrols. The objective of the diver patrols was to intercept the V1s before they reached their target and shoot them down. It was found that the Tempest, Mustang, Spitfire and Mosquitoes were fast enough to catch the Doodlebugs. The Typhoons were tasked to pulverize the V1 launching sites with their massive armament.
And then after Falaise, which the Typhoons were very much responsible for destroying the SS divisions in Falaise, advanced with the army through Belgium, Holland and finally Germany.
Die feindlichen Maschinen im Visier. Die Feuerstöße gehen aus Rammnähe in die Terrorbomber hinein.
Although much depleted, the Luftwaffe could still put up a resistance to the ever-advancing Allied armies and air forces.
Jetzt erfolgt der massierte Angriff der Sturmgruppe. Die Feuerstöße jagen heraus. Mit einem Schlag geht der ganze Feindverband brennend in die Tiefe.
On the ground, German divisions still resisted wherever they could. But retreat back into Germany was inevitable.
And there was a Canadian pilot called P.V. Williams, and he was hit. In fact, we didn't see any plume of white, and so we called him up and said, "You're going the wrong way." And he said, "I'm hit and paralyzed." And so he could not control the aircraft, and it must have taken him several minutes before he hit the ground at a sort of gradual glide. And the last thing he said to me, "Order me a late tea."
And finally they went into France, Belgium, Holland, and at last Germany itself, with the conquering Allied liberation forces in the great days of 1944 and 5. Occupying the overrun airfields of the Germans, they moved up with the armies into Belgium and Holland, keeping up the pressure on the enemy's supply lines, smashing his centers of communication, driving his aircraft out of the sky, and keeping our own intelligence service informed of his movements.
In Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, the weather was very wet, and we were living in tents. And the serviceability of the aircraft was excellent. You had your own team of mechanics who became really your family, because you knew them so well, and they knew you so well, and they really looked after you.
Another problem, of course, was always the spark plugs. If they got oiled up, 24 spark plugs to change. Lot of unhappy engine guys, 24 spark plugs out, clean them up, put them back in again. So they always took good care of their engines, just because they didn't like to work for a living.
As the Typhoon squadrons moved into Germany, they had to contend with airfields that had been carpet-bombed by the Allies.
The problem is, of course, you can't see where you're going on a tail-sitter aircraft. And so, it was up to the troops. Get on the wingtips and shout at your pilot, wave at him. Eventually they would develop types of communication, hand signal, for left, right, stop. Why would he stop? So the guy could then get onto the other wingtip and push him backwards. They would do their best to repair the greater craters. They had to. Aeroplanes fully laden with weapons, fuel, they don't like, especially when they're going across really rough ground, they don't like being cranked sideways here, there and everywhere. They don't like it at all. Ground crew on the wingtip, come rain or shine, dust or snow, point to the pilot, go left, go right, okay, goodbye.
Though we were really very effective, but we had also enormous losses, which was something completely new to us. And furthermore, it was very difficult to get replacements. Though the fighter pool at Lasham was full of young fighter pilots, nobody in those days, and I'm talking now the latter half of 44 and the beginning of 45, wanted to join the Typhoon squadron, the rocket Typhoon squadron, because they heard about these tremendous losses.
Oh, the poor old Tiffy. Oh dear. The Typhoon was built for a job. It didn't do its initial job, it went on to do another job, that of an excellent, outstanding ground attack fighter. However, there was never ever going to be a place in the post-war Royal Air Force for an aircraft like the Typhoon. New aircraft were being built, they were going straight to the maintenance units. However, there weren't that many engines being built. The airplane would fly into the maintenance unit, engine propeller would be removed, back to the Hawkers for the next one, new aeroplane in a field. 6 months later, it's saucepans. So by 1946, any Typhoon left was in the field somewhere, waiting to be chopped up, except for one that was in the United States, on armament trials, and would end up in the Smithsonian Museum and would eventually, courtesy of a swap, end up in the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon.
Over 500 Typhoons were lost after D-Day, but 247 enemy aircraft were destroyed by the Tiffy.
I liked the aircraft, yes. And I think it was an extremely efficient close support weapon for the army at that time.
A lot of people didn't like it, but I did on the whole. She was not a very nice lady. You had to keep her well in check at all times, but on the whole she was great, because it's not every day you get to fly an aircraft that can do 420 miles an hour, at least not in those days.
It could become a monster in a way.
Well, she wasn't an airplane really, she was a flying gun platform.
Other point that was very interesting with the combined rocket and Typhoon attack was the sheer obliteration. It was equal to the broadside of a 6-inch cruiser.
I enjoyed my time in the Typhoon because I enjoyed being in the squadron. But I can't say that I was very keen on attacking engines, railway engines at night. It was very difficult to spot them. And when you had spotted them, we were attacking them over the most heavily defended part of France. And it was no fun, at least it wasn't any fun to me.
I found that the longer I flew the Typhoon, the more I loved it. It was an aircraft that could take any amount of damage, any amount of flak, and it would get you home. And it would land you safely back at base. It was really, really strong. And of course, being powerful, it gave you a sense of superiority.
Hawkers, when they came up with the Typhoon, were looking to build a high-speed fighter that was really, really good at all altitudes. Problems with the Napier engine meant that it was good at medium to low altitudes. changes of emphasis of tactics meant it became possibly the most outstanding ground attack aeroplane of the Second World War.
You're cruising at 400 knots, which is a speed at which the Focke-Wulfs and the 109s had to attain in a bit of a dive to get to you. So I know you had to be careful of the Hun on the tail, but he had to come from a long way up and a long way down to catch you up at 400 knots, I can tell you.
So did the Typhoon do its job properly? Yes, I think it did.
Tempest. In comparison to the Typhoon, in fact there was no comparison. It was comparing a cart horse to a race horse.